If you love trucks like I do, a deep dive into the history and specifications of the World War II M26 Dragon Wagon is a trip into a dream world. This was the biggest, strongest, and most awesome truck the United States produced in World War II, and by the time we're done here today, you're going to know all about everything you ever wanted or needed to know about this beastly giant of a rig. Beyond its size, this was an amazingly complex machine that served with honor in the war and had peacetime uses that went on long after its battlefield duties had ended. Many people are into the vehicles of World War II, whether we're talking about airplanes, battleships, tanks, submarines, or other variants. There's a lot to be awed by. But me, I'm into the trucks. The fighting vehicles tend to get all the attention, and that makes sense. Heroic pilots making daring raids on enemy positions, fearless tankers charging into battle with their rumbling steel beasts, captains firing guns with bores measuring more than a foot to take out enemy fleets. These are all the images that have been made iconic in songs, movies, and television series. But trucks? Trucks win wars beyond all the other stuff I just mentioned. Trucks serve as a logistical backbone of any army. Getting people, things, and material from place to place as quickly as possible is what ultimately lets you beat the bad guys. Yes, it may be the most boring aspect of any military story, but it's the truth. And because of the importance of trucks during World War II, there are hundreds of sizes, varieties, specialized rigs, and even proposed machines that never turned a wheel beyond the blueprint stage, all of which are fascinating to me. But all that being said, the massive M26 stands alone for me and so many others when looking back over the vehicles of World War II. Let's travel back to December 29th, 1940. Most of the nation is huddled around their radios to listen to the 16th of FDR's famed fireside chats. During it, the population of the United States heard FDR say these words, which I have excerpted from the full transcript of his inspiring monologue. "We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself. We must apply ourselves to our task with the same resolution, the same sense of urgency, the same spirit of patriotism and sacrifice as we would show were we at war. We have furnished the British great material support and will furnish far more in the future. There will be no bottlenecks in our determination to aid Great Britain. No dictator, no combination of dictators, will weaken the determination by threats of how they will construe that determination. The British have received invaluable military support from the heroic Greek army and from the forces of all governments in exile. Their strength is growing. It is the strength of men and women who value their freedom more highly than they value their lives. I believe that the Axis powers are not going to win this war. I base that belief on the latest and best information. We have no excuse for defeatism. We have every reason for hope. Hope for peace, yes, and hope for the defense of our civilization and for the building of a better civilization in the future. I have the profound conviction that the American people are now determined to put forth a mightier effort than they have ever made, yet to increase our production of all the implements of defense to meet the threat to our democratic faith." End quote. It's important to realize that this is basically a year before the Pearl Harbor attack of 1941. The United States was not in the war per se, but they were manufacturing. And from this arsenal of democracy speech forward, everything changed. The tone of the nation changed, the direction of the nation changed, and the industrial colossus of the United States began to wake up. In fact, it was from this very point forward and in the ensuing years that the United States would become an industrial engine that the Axis had no answer for. In fact, as history tells us, once the United States was fully engaged in the war and FDR's arsenal of democracy was firing on all cylinders, the levels of production of everything from bombers to trucks was so great that our enemies literally didn't believe their own reporting as to the volume of machines and material pouring out of our factories nationwide. Not only were we cranking out incredible volume, we were evolving with the conflict itself. The machines of 1943 through 1945 were nothing like the machines of 1940 through 1942. Technology changed, things became faster, more complex, more powerful, and more effective. This was particularly true in the world of tanks. As tanks took on a larger and larger part of the effort, the need to move them, recover them, and haul them around also became more important. When the war kicked off, the U.S. military did have some big trucks at their disposal to support their track brethren, and they were the 10-ton M1 heavy wrecker that could tow up to 70,000 pounds, basically the weight of an M4 Sherman. There was also the burly 10-ton class M123. This was used in heavy-duty recovery work as well. It had many of the basic elements we'll later be talking about with regard to the M26, And some say the M123 was also the first truck to be called the Dragon Wagon by soldiers that saw it at work in the field. Beyond those two trucks, there was a 12-ton class-rated Diamond T M20. This was a rear-wheel drive tractor designed to haul up to 120,000 pounds on a special 24-wheel trailer known as the M9. The truck had a 40,000-pound winch behind the cab, massive axles from Timken, and gearing that would make a farm tractor enthusiast blush. A 900 cubic inch Hercules DXFE diesel, which made about 185 horsepower and torque in the 800 foot-pound range, helped this lumbering giant do its job, albeit very slowly. When the M26 showed up on the scene, these giant M20s, which struggled in any off-road situation, got moved to jobs behind the lines of battle on the logistical side of supporting the front. Now, with its incredible pulling power, these were especially good for ammunition hauling, as they could move it up to 120,000 pounds at a time, if not more, and typically, it was more. As we'll learn through this video, the weight ratings placed on many things were basically there as a rough guideline. In times of war, soldiers and whoever was operating the equipment didn't have any problem seemingly overloading anything and everything in sight, and the M20 was certainly a truck that did not escape that fate, as did all the others. Now this brings us back to the birth of the truck we're talking about today, the M26. And everything about this truck is interesting, including the way it came to exist. During the North Africa campaign waged by the Allies against the Axis, American observers saw early on that lots of armored vehicles that had sustained damage, even of the repairable kind, were just being left in the desert, never to see fighting again. From those observations arose the need to design and employ a tank retriever and hauler that could perform the job not just on solid ground, but really anywhere the work needed to be done. The M20 was a great working truck so long as it didn't have to leave the pavement. After that, all bets are off. Word went up the chain of command, and in the 1942 timeframe, the call was put out to American industry to design a go-anywhere vehicle that had the capability of getting to, recovering, and quickly transporting virtually any size piece of armored weaponry the Allies had in the field, especially the ubiquitous M4 Sherman tank, which again came in at roughly 70,000 pounds. The successful design came from an unlikely place, as they so often do in these situations. The Nucky Truck Company of San Francisco was a small concern that was in the business of building large-capacity dump trucks for mining and off-highway earth-moving projects. They basically adapted their massive 20-ton dump truck chassis into the foundation of what we would eventually call the M26. The biggest thing the Nucky design had going for it was their chain-driven rear axle assembly, which they had engineered for use on their dump trucks. It was a robust and simple design, and it was just what the doctor ordered for a military truck. Nucky trucks use massive gas engines, fuller manual transmissions, and frames that would be mistaken as bridge spans if you didn't know any better. Their design incorporated a huge 20-ton Garwood front winch, 10-wheel drive, two 30-ton rear winches behind the cab, and an adjustable fifth wheel for hauling a trailer. The cab was a massive fortress of a thing. Capable of seating 7 people, it had 3/4-inch thick steel armor in the front, and 1/4-inch thick or thicker armor on the sides and roof. Speaking of the roof, there was a mount for a 50 cal machine gun up there, and the cab had plenty of small arms stowage as well. The rear chain drive axles were on a walking beam style suspension, which allowed for amazingly good off-road capability, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. So how serious was this thing on paper? The tractor alone, with nothing else attached to it, weighed 42,960 pounds and had a gross vehicle weight of 108,895 pounds. The tread width center to center was 80 inches. The tractor had a 177-inch wheelbase with a total length of 306 inches. The cab was 10 feet 4 inches tall and 130 inches wide. The shape of the cab allowed for a 35-degree approach angle. The truck could walk over 20-inch vertical obstacles. It had an 80-foot turning circle, and perhaps most awesomely, it had a fording depth of nearly 5 feet with a 56-inch depth that it could drive through without any sort of trouble. And we're just getting started. As so often happens with military contracts, just because you have the best design, you don't always get to reap the full reward of making it. Just look at the Jeep for the greatest example of this. Remember, Bantam won the contract, couldn't make the production quotas, and after making just 2,600 Jeeps, Ford and Willis Overland took over the manufacturing for the tens of thousands of machines that would be produced through the rest of the war. Now, these giant trucks were not going to be made in the volume of Jeeps, but they were complicated to make. They were heavy, labor-intensive, and the construction would take a while. Nucky found themselves quickly in trouble in terms of production volume. So in February of 1943, the U.S. government awarded a contract of $43,061,000 to the Pacific Car and Foundry Company of Renton, Washington, to produce about 1,100 of the trucks. This places the unit cost at just shy of $40,000 apiece, and when you look at one of these things, that's a pretty good deal, right? Now, you may recognize the name Pacific Car and Foundry Company when it is shortened to PACCAR. This is the company that's still in business today, producing Peterbilt and Kenworth trucks. Production began as quickly as possible in 1942 and carried through until December of 1943 in Renton, Washington. It was at this point that production was moved to the Billings, Montana PACCAR factory, where it would stay until the end of the war. Now, a total production run of just under 1,400 M26 trucks were produced. Of the roughly 1,400 trucks, the first 735 were equipped with that totally awesome armored cab. Roughly halfway through production, two things were realized. First, it was realized that when these trucks were going to recover tanks, it was post-battle action, and the armor was probably unnecessary. The second was that the front tires of the truck were blowing out every few thousand miles because of the staggering weight of the cab itself. So beginning with truck 736, the M26A1 was introduced for the rest of the production run. This had an unarmored cab. Mechanically, the rest of the truck was identical, but removing the armor from the cab took somewhere between 10 and 20,000 pounds off the front axle. This made the trucks easier to operate, increased visibility dramatically, and increased front tire life exponentially. It did still have the mount for the .50 caliber machine gun on the roof, though, so not all was lost. Now, there was a secondary part of this contract as well, and that was for the M15 trailer that the big M26 would tow. This contract went to the Fruhoff Company, which is still in business making trailers today, but this one was something special. Rated for 120,000 pounds, this beefy trailer weighed 17.5 tons before anything was placed upon its back, and was specifically created for loading tanks onto, both intact and broken. There were 8 wheels at the rear that matched those on the M26 pulling it. There were interesting covers that would be placed over the tires to protect them when winching on busted tanks as well. The trailers, like most military vehicles, were regularly overloaded, and there are 0 reports of failures, breakage, or issues with the unit, no matter what soldiers threw at it or on it. Now, there are reports of more than 100 tons riding on these trucks and trailers, neither of them breaking a sweat. You'll sometimes hear this truck referred to as the M25, and this can get confusing, so here's a quick explainer. The tractor itself with the armored cab is the M26. The unarmored cab version of the tractor is the M26A1. The trailer itself is the M15. Now, for the first couple of years when the truck and tractor were together, the whole unit was called an M25. Finally, someone decided that this was redundant, and it was simply referred to as the M26, and Bob's your uncle. So now we know some specs and the origin story of the M26, but let's get into the good stuff, the real deep dive tech that makes this machine so very, very special. Of course, we need to start with the engine, and what an engine it was. Hall Scott was the engine provider, and sitting basically in the cab with the crew of the M26 was a Hall Scott 440. This was a 240 horsepower, 1,090 cubic inch gasoline-burning inline 6 that made over 900 pound-feet of torque at right around 1,200 RPM. The Hall Scott 440 as an engine is a story in and unto itself. The Hall Scott Engine Company, based in Berkeley, California, opened in 1910. By the time World War II rolled around, was recognized as one of the best heavy-duty engine manufacturers in the country. Their marine and heavy-duty truck and bus power plants were simply the best in the industry. All the way back to World War I, the company was building engines with hemispherical combustion chambers, aluminum pistons and blocks, overhead camshafts and valves, and more. Their airplane engines were a lucrative business during the war, and in what would become a theme for the company, when the war ended, business hit the skids. Employing the kind of industrial creativity that would become a hallmark of the company, Hall Scott trudged its way through the Depression, and by the late 1930s, was in legitimately bad financial shape. But thankfully, they did have an ace up their sleeve. In 1931, the company developed a large marine inline 6, which they called the Invader. With the clouds of war starting to gather and the United States getting slowly into preparatory mode, the military came knocking on Hall Scott's door. The government wanted an engine that was much more powerful than the Invader Inline 6 for naval projects, and the ever-inventive Hall Scott Company said no problem. They created the Defender V12, which was in some effect 2 Invaders joined together, and through the war, They built more than 6,500 of them for the military, most of them going to power marine applications. But the Inline-6 Invader, which was licensed to Hudson, was a perfect fit for a lot of other boats and platforms, and so they also were sold in great numbers, which led to the ever-resourceful Hall Scott having a brilliant idea in 1940. They took this engine, which had been introduced a decade before, and converted the marine engine into a land engine, and that is where the magic happened. The company took the Invader design and made internal changes. Those changes included things like larger crankshaft journals, new connecting rods, smaller valves in the cylinder heads, new pistons, and they created the 400 series of engines. The neatest of which, I think, was the 1,090 cubic inch inline-6 that would eventually power the M26 tractor. So how do you get 1,090 cubic inches with only 6 cylinders? Try a 5 3/4 inch bore with a 7-inch stroke. Now what's interesting is that the government went to Hall Scott and told them they wanted the 400 series inline-6, but they wanted some of their own modifications, which birthed the engine we now know as the Hall Scott 440, the engine used in the M26. The government changes weren't too drastic. They wanted a shaft-driven power steering pump, the addition of a PCV system, and a beefier water pump drive shaft, as well as a bypass-style oiling system, and they also wanted the compression ratio dropped to 5.4 to 1. The compression ratio drop was because of the low-grade gasoline the trucks would be forced to run on in battlefield or forward operating conditions. And the only real adverse change here is the fact that the horsepower number came down from 290 to 240 with the reduction in compression ratio. The upside is that the engine then became an anvil that would basically live forever. So to review, this truck was powered by a near 1,100 cubic inch inline-6 that used a hemispherical, cross-flow, opposed valve style cylinder head, an overhead camshaft, overhead valves, twin plugs per cylinder, and had a dry weight of 2,500 pounds. Everything, and I mean everything about that, is awesome, especially when we put it in the context of 1943. Hall Scott was a unique engine-building outfit. I mean, they were a large company in many ways, but they operated like a small, almost boutique firm. Their engines were literally hand-built, and this made them of the best quality, but also meant they couldn't truly produce engines in massive quantity. And this is why they always got the smaller contracts. Orders for the 1,400 M26 engines and the 6,500 Defenders that were spread out over the course of half a decade or more pretty much defined Hall Scott in the war. Their stuff may not have been produced as fast, but Hall Scott engines were of unassailable quality. Interestingly, the M26 would be the only truck in World War II that came with power steering. The sheer massive size of the thing made it a necessity, and it was perhaps the only luxury that existed in the stifling cab of the armored M26, which had little to no airflow and the steel window coverings were up. Backing our huge engine was an equally huge clutch, a 15-inch dual-disc unit made by the Light Rollway Corporation. The transmission, well, technically transmissions, were a primary 4-speed Fuller 4B86 4-speed, backed by an additional 3-speed Spicer 703A Brownie box. This allowed the truck to basically have 12 forward speeds because the two transmissions operated separately. You'd have first gear low, first gear direct, first gear high. And then you could go second gear low, second gear direct, second gear high, or any combination you wanted depending on the load and how much of a hurry you were in. As a note of comparison to illustrate the nature of the parts used here, a Muncie 4-speed weighs about 80 pounds. The Fuller 4-speed itself weighed 420 pounds, and the auxiliary transmission, well, that thing was also made of pig iron and weighed hundreds more pounds as well, but both units were indestructible. The front axle was a massive Timken unit, and the truck had 769 gearing front and back. With 120 gallons of fuel on board, the truck could go 120 miles. The top speed is listed at 28 miles per hour, but in other places it does say limiters were added to keep the trucks at 45 miles per hour and below. There are some stories on the internet stating that these things could go 80 miles an hour, which is not only a fantastic exaggeration, it's a lie that physics can prove out. Take the max RPM of the engine, the gear ratios, and the height of the tire, there is zero chance it could go 80, and even 45 seems like it would have its tongue hanging out. Couple that with the fact that the tractor had rear brakes only, and the trailer did have brakes, but with a 70-ton tank on the back and all your braking happening at the rear of the vehicle, traveling 80 miles an hour is a recipe for abject disaster. To move the winches, the truck used a Spicer 265 power takeoff unit that actually had multiple speeds. Because this thing was feeding power to the winches, the multiple speeds were a good option depending on the type of recovery being attempted. The massive Garwood winches mounted front and rear were legendary in their ability to not only handle their rated loads, but to sometimes work at double their rating without so much as breaking a sweat. Now would probably be a good time to explain two things that might be foreign concepts to many watching this video. The first is how a chain drive truck works, and specifically how this chain drive truck works, and the neat benefit of the usage of a walking beam rear suspension. Chain-driven trucks had been around since the turn of the century, and over time they were refined and altered, but the basic principles remained the same. Chain drive simplified a lot of problems, especially those in very heavy or large vehicles. Effectively, you have an engine and transmission, and you have a differential. That differential is hard mounted to the frame and has sprockets on the ends. These sprockets run down to corresponding sprockets on the rear brake drums or a similar area, and this is what drives the wheels. It's simple, it's durable, and it's very easily repaired. Like we talked about before, the Nucky chain drive setup was perfect for these big M26 trucks. It was basically a modular unit. There were two dead axles front and rear, and a live axle in the center that got its power from a drive shaft off the back of the transfer case. That live axle sprockets carried chains that connected to the hubs on either end of the dead axles, and voila, all 8 rear tires were driven. It sounds reasonably complicated, but it is very simple, as you can see in these illustrations. Now, one of the interesting things about these trucks is that they had constant chain oilers. Basically, they had these little tanks full of oil that were set to constantly drip on the chains as the truck was driving. And this meant everywhere these trucks went, they threw oil on the ground. Stories from World War II indicate that they literally left a trail on the road behind them. Note there are chain guards to stop the oil from being thrown upward and forward. It was all directed down, and every 120 miles when the fuel tanks were being filled, the chain oiler tanks were being filled as well. One last thing to talk about is the walking beam rear suspension that also made these trucks so effective off-road. A walking beam suspension is a very simple and effective system, especially for large trucks that may see some off-road action and they need to keep as much contact patch on the ground as possible. Effectively, you have 2 beams, one on each side of the frame in parallel. The beams have a center pivot point which allows them to act like a giant rocker arm, and because in this case the truck is chain-driven, one side acts with complete independence from the other. This will allow for massive amounts of articulation, and again, the goal is maximum traction here at all times, and this works in spades. Unlike many walking beam setups, the M26 didn't use a massive leaf spring, but rather some really heavy double coil springs that were mounted at the end of each beam to provide some stability and control, especially when there was a load on the 5th wheel. Let's just say that the M26, loaded or unloaded, did not have a Cadillac-style ride going down the road. And the last point to make about the M26 is the fact that this huge truck was a complete and utterly awesome study in practical engineering. Hauling 7 men, carrying tools to make field repairs, having a crane to replace tires with, carrying gas bottles and all the necessary supplies to run a welding crew, carrying enough winches to pull the earth off its axis, and 100% of it was analog and mechanical. For instance, the rate of the front winch spool was matched perfectly to the speed of the truck when it was in first gear low range. Why? So if the M26 was pulling itself out of somewhere, the truck and winch would work in perfect unison, not one fighting against the other to move the load. That type of thinking pervades this entire massive truck. There was a rear lifting truss that could be raised with cables run over it, and all of a sudden this thing became a basically 50-ton tow truck that was not only capable of pulling tanks up grades and out of pits, but it was capable of towing them back to a base to be repaired. No trailer? No problem. The M26 also carried a tow bar so heavy it took at least 2 guys to carry it. They would bolt it on the front of the tank, they would bolt it to the back of the M26, and the truck would just straight up drag the tank, no matter what type of shape of repair or disrepair it was in, back to a repair station or away from danger. The M26 was basically a massive, overgrown Swiss Army knife of a truck, and it was manned by 7 soldiers who had been trained to use every one of its facets in every possible way. And these guys are also ultra resourceful. So all the things the truck thought it could do, there was probably 20 or 30 more functions developed by soldiers over the course of the war that no one had thought of, but these guys employed in situations that required them to get creative. The crews that worked on these trucks put in long and very hard hours. They were basically wartime wrecker operators, and every recovery they went to was of a machine that weighed dozens and dozens of tons. And as cool as these trucks were, danger was ever present. Between the cables, the winches, the weight involved, the work being done, accidents can happen. Accidents did happen, and when accidents happen with a truck with a gross vehicle weight of some 150,000 pounds with a tank on its back, you can imagine the results are not pretty. The trucks moved way more than just tanks as well. They hauled supplies, landing craft, trucks, other armor, and whatever else needed to be moved wherever else it needed to be moved to. The armored cab version, to me, is just incredible looking, and several of those design elements persist in military trucks today. The unarmored M26A1 cab just looks totally different, but both trucks have the same heart and soul and the same Herculean strength to get the job done. Now, if you stuck around this long, you're wondering what happened with these things post-war. Well, until 1954, they were the primary tank movers that the military had. They were replaced by a massive Mack version with more power, more speed, and more capability. But there was at least one M26 that landed a cherry job. What was it? Working for NASA. As you can see in these photos, an M26 was employed dragging the massive pieces of the Saturn V rocket around during the Apollo space program. The load showed here were many hundreds of thousands of pounds, and the big old M26 didn't care a lick. Chugging around at basically walking speed, this M26 would haul these rocket parts around to various points at Cape Canaveral. It even traveled on ferries to go to different parts of the country as well. This truck, having been built in wartime, had a very relaxing retirement gig where it got to get out and stretch its legs every once in a while, and I'm sure that's something we could all get used to. So there's a look back at the long and complete story of the M26 Dragon Wagon, the most awesome truck of World War II. Like and subscribe for more automotive and historical gearhead content.